Hello everyone, this is Adrian with another section from Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front 1975 to 1991 by Dr. John Young. Nationalist basis of revolution. This is continued from chapter 1. Nationalism or ethno-nationalism, since the Tigrayan rebellion was for ethnic autonomy within a single Ethiopian state, figured prominently in the mobilization of both the petite bourgeoisie and the peasants. Exponents of the peasant revolt thesis hold that peasants rebel when major changes in the economy undermine their way of life. They thus recognize peasants to be economic beings, but not political beings capable of giving nationalist interpretations to changes in their economy and way of life. However, prior to the modern era, both the nobility and peasants of Tigray regularly voiced national grievances. Until the advent of the TPLF-led revolution, these protests took place within the context of struggle for state power between various regional and ethnic-based nobilities. Efforts began in the Middle Ages and continued through Haile Selassie and the Derg to centralize state powers by weakening political and cultural influences in the periphery. However, it speaks of the prevalence of national sentiments in Tigray that in spite of its increasing marginalization in an empire dominated by Amharas from Shoa, it was the only province able to maintain a measure of political autonomy and be ruled by members of its own nobility prior to the revolution of 1974. As a movement, nationalism was not able to acquire a mass basis of support until recently because the Ethiopian state was poorly integrated and ethnic minorities had little contact with one another or state government. Nationalism is thus a phenomenon identified with modernization. It begins with advances in communication, transportation, and the media, which progressively curtail cultural isolation and break down former identities. An unintegrated state is not a threat to the existence of ethnic communities, but improvements to communications and transportation increase cultural awareness of minorities and their relationship to others, particularly the dominant ethnic group in the state. These same facets of modernization serve to undermine primordial identities. According to Brass, quote, ethnic identity and modern nationalism arise out of specific types of interactions between the leaderships of centralizing states and elites from non-dominant ethnic groups, especially but not exclusively on the peripheries of those states. In Tigray, these processes can largely be dated from the brief period of Italian colonialism that began in 1935, but they only produced a nationalist movement with a province-wide base of support after the overthrow of the old regime in 1974 and emergence of the TPLF in 1975. The construction of roads in particular fostered the growth of markets for the peasants' produce, as well as providing employment opportunities, thus linking traditionally isolated villages to the wider world. Schools served a similar function and, most importantly, fostered a unifying Tigray-wide nationalism. The development of infrastructure served to weaken or break down primordial loyalties which had long divided Tigrayans. At the same time, modernization involved incorporation and centralization, which resulted in a more intrusive role for the state in the lives of peasants, which in turn made the state a focus for anger that transcended region, class, religion, and other divisions. These processes were already well developed when the Derg came to power and broke the peasants' most significant links to the state by its elimination of Ras Mengesha's administration, while the Land Proclamation of 1975 served to complete the task of destroying the basis of patron-client relations. Thus, when the TPLF launched its rebellion, the Tigrayan peasantry were less than ethnic community, they fought for position, status, and employment in a multi-ethnic state, dominated by Shoan Amharas in a struggle that was both a continuation of centuries-old rivalry and also involved interests in the acquisition and articulation of various rights for their community. Unlike the petite bourgeoisie, Tigrayan peasants did not interact on a regular basis with other ethnic communities in the past, and this did not dramatically change within Tigray even under the impact of modernization and state centralization. Nonetheless, Amhara supremacy in the state was felt by peasants through contact with police, court officials, tax collectors, church dignitaries, and governors, few of whom were Amhara, but most of whom spoke the official language of the state. In their dealings with the others who spoke a different language, the privileged position of Amharas in Ethiopia was also experienced directly by peasants who traveled outside the province, either in pursuit of employment and trade or to settle land disputes in Addis Ababa courts. This may not have given form to a nationalist movement were it not that Tigrayans had a deep pride in their heritage and had long been ruled by people from their own ethnic community. Tigrayan peasants assume their cultural heritage to include being Semitic descendants of the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, heirs to the ancient Aksumite Empire, early bearers of Christianity, and the source of many traditions and values subsequently absorbed by the Amhara elite. Thus, for a people aptly described as the cultural aristocrats of Ethiopia, Tigray's decline and in this century its poverty fueled by a sense of national grievance, which readily found expression in hostility to the Amhara elite who dominated the central state. It is thus not surprising that the TPLF appeal was largely based on the perception that Tigrayans suffered discrimination at the hands of the Shoan Amhara elite. And while there is evidence to support this view, other ethnic communities and regions suffered similar or worse forms of discrimination without posing a serious challenge to the state. In contrast to theories which attempt to explain the development of ethnic nationalism in terms of inequality, this study reinforces the conclusions of Moore and Brass, who both argue that the mere existence of inequality is not sufficient to produce nationalist movements, and anti-state movements may even arise among dominant groups. Indeed, it was not until the final days of the Derg regime that revolutionaries in the southern highlands of Ethiopia, most of whose peoples had long suffered exploitation at the hands of northerners, were able to mount a sustained rebellion. Instead, opposition to the regime was overwhelmingly dominated by Eritreans and Tigrayans who have been associated with the Ethiopian state for centuries. Although nationalists, Tigrayans have not been prepared to relinquish their links to Ethiopian civilization and the state their ancestors created. Moreover, while the peasants' local and culturally based nationalism underpinned the Tigrayan revolution, it did not determine the TPLF's national objectives. The Tigrayan youth who formed the TPLF developed their ideology in the Ethiopian student movement of the 1960s and 1970s, which fought the old regime and the military dictatorship on a pan-Ethiopian basis. Meles Zenawi, current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and the other Tigrayan students were leaders of that movement, and their establishment of the TPLF did not mark a retreat into ethnic parochialism, but instead proved to be an accurate assessment of the revolutionary possibilities in the country at that time. However, while nationalism was critical to the success of the TPLF, it was equally important for the movement to address the social concerns and needs of the peasants, and this brought to the fore the role of political leadership. Peasant revolt theorists fail to appreciate the role of political leadership in the course and outcome of revolutions flows from their inability to distinguish between the structurally necessary conditions for revolutions to occur and the processes involved in carrying out revolutions. Concentration on the context in which revolutions emerge has meant ignoring the equally critical process pursued by revolutionaries to replace the existing order and state with their alternative. This mistaken emphasis produces one-sided explanations that attempt to explain revolutions solely by the existence of particular structural conditions. Such explanations are invariably easier to make after the event than before, and even the most thought-out structurally premised explanations are unlikely to cast much light on the course of the revolution, which group will eventually take power, and the character of the new regime. The Derg in Tigray was in many ways the author of its own destruction, but only if it is appreciated that the Derg's policies and the way they were implemented alienated the Tigrayan people. To assume that hatred of the regime in and of itself produces revolution denies the critical role that the Revolutionary Party, the TPLF, played in mobilizing and giving expression to that resentment. The importance of leadership provided by the Revolutionary Party in shaping the peasant uprising is largely ignored by exponents of the peasant revolt thesis in favor of peasant spontaneity. However, it is clear that in Tigray, party-directed organization and mobilization in the pursuit of war rather than peasant initiative better explains the course of the revolution. And in this light, Marxism, and particularly its Leninist and Maoist variants, proved of considerable value in terms of organizing the administration and propaganda in the liberated territories, systematizing party life, and developing the military structures needed to conduct increasingly sophisticated warfare. The TPLF's approach to the peasants show a debt to Mao's axiom that in order to make a revolution, the Communist Party has to build an army, and given the conditions in post-1927 China and in underdeveloped Tigray, that army could only be based on peasants. Indeed, early TPLF publications repeatedly highlight Mao, and the front's strategy closely follows what Johnson has identified as the three most influential components of his work: the mass line, the stress on self-reliance, and protracted war. The mass line emphasized taking up social and political problems of the masses and interpreting them in terms that advanced revolutionary consciousness, but at the same time spurned ideological dogmatism. By following this approach, the TPLF was able to address the concrete problems of Tigrayan peasants, be ideologically open to changing circumstances, and avoid the political sterility that characterized most of the Ethiopian revolutionary movements during the period. Mao's belief in self-reliance was readily accepted by the TPLF, which had no foreign bases, external sources of arms, or international champions. But perhaps most influential was Mao's notion of protracted war, which was based on and mirrored the Tigrayan situation, where external assistance was limited and the revolutionaries faced armed forces which were vastly superior. From these conditions, it followed that the achievement of a military balance would involve a long war of attrition. The TPLF's commitment to the peasants' well-being thus flowed from an appreciation that the revolutionaries' success depended upon its ability to militarily challenge the Derg, and for this it needed the unreserved support of the peasants. Contrary to assumed notions of the peasants' collective ethos and voluntarism, the revolutionary context in Tigray's province is best informed by Migdal's notion of the need for a social exchange between peasants and revolutionaries. Such a peasant is only prepared to join the revolution after a careful consideration for the prospects of victory and the benefits that would be gained by joining the revolution versus what would be lost by not joining. In such a relationship, the revolutionary assumes the role of a political entrepreneur whose appeal is evaluated by the assessment peasants make of the revolutionary's personal credibility and capability. These notions are well expressed by a TPLF official who said that often a peasant meeting would not end until there was a resolution and an agreement to carry out some reform. In many parts of Tigray, this commitment was to land reform, and only after Betos were set up and land reform carried out were peasants prepared to defend their institutions and join the TPLF as fighters. Peasants' support for the TPLF only began to develop after cadres successfully demonstrated their commitment to the peasants' welfare by living with them and sharing their deprivations. The cadres' exemplary behavior, particularly when compared to that of members of other revolutionary parties, served to build confidence among the peasantry. In addition, the high standards of personal behavior and commitment displayed by the TPLF leadership reinforced the loyalty of the largely youth membership of the movement. Older Tigrayan peasants who had contact with the various revolutionary movements that competed for their support in the 1970s can usually distinguish their main ideological differences, but significantly, it is the personal characteristics of the fighters they emphasize, thus confirming the validity of the TPLF's approach. It also bears out both Cabral's finding that revolutionaries have to identify with the deepest aspirations of the people and the conclusion of Popkin that peasants measure revolutionaries by their personal credibility. The TPLF linked the revolution's goals to the lives of the peasants by using traditional and modern cultural forms to connect their past battles, particularly those which were held to defend or advance the national interest. But it was not manipulating peasant values. In the case of Tigray, these same peasants' values placed limits on and gave shape to the course of the TPLF's military campaign and its program to transform agrarian society. While the TPLF's commitment to social transformation cannot be doubted, it is also true that in areas such as religion, gender relations, and economic institutions, an accord of sorts was struck that balanced the peasants' more conservative values against the TPLF's program. The image of the Tigrayan peasant that emerges is thus not a creature that takes precipitous or spontaneous actions as suggested by some theorists, nor can such peasants be readily manipulated by revolutionaries as was argued by would-be leaders of the peasants in the many Ethiopian revolutionary movements that failed. Although driven to destitution by the crisis in the rural economy, most Tigrayan peasants did not rush to the revolutionary banner, but instead stood back and evaluated the ideals and programs of the movements contesting for their support, considered the personal credibility of the revolutionaries, and judged their prospects of defeating the Derg before pledging themselves. While peasants were not in a position to set the political agenda of the revolution, they did have a real influence over the course and conduct of it. Working within the peasants' cultural milieu to gain their support meant that the TPLF had to accept the constraints that environment imposed. It also meant constantly evaluating the impact of TPLF reforms on the community on the one hand against the front's ability to wage war against the Derg on the other. Implementing the TPLF's program of reform served as both an instrument with which to transform rural society and a means to mobilize popular support for the war. However, these are not always complementary goals since the social tensions caused by transformation may open up divisions that undermine the widest possible consensus needed to carry on a revolutionary war. A study of Tigrayan experience thus makes clear that a crucial function of the political leadership of revolutionary parties is to construct an appropriate balance between the need for reform and that for social peace. As a result of its sensitivity in dealing with the peasants, the TPLF was able to command great loyalty, oversee a major program of social change, and in the process give form to the most powerful political and military movement in post-imperial Ethiopia. Ultimately, structural conditions do not dictate what people do, but merely place limits on human action or define a certain range of possibilities. Critical to the success of revolutionaries is their need to understand the constraints and realize the possibilities of the circumstances in which they are operating. Nor can it be forgotten that while skillful political leadership of the Revolutionary Party will not produce revolutions in the absence of suitable structural conditions, even the most fitting structural conditions for revolution will not lead to revolution without competent political leadership. The success of the TPLF, when seen against the failure of a host of revolutionary groups, provides ample evidence of the support of political leadership. Conclusion. Exponents of the peasant revolt thesis explain revolution as arising in the context of modernizing societies undergoing rapid and destabilizing change brought by the introduction of commercial agriculture. Such change destroys traditional systems of agriculture, undermines patron-client relations, and serves as the stimulus for peasants to revolt. Like Marxist premised explanations, they are concerned with structural change and its implications, but discount the proletariat and argue that most revolutions in the modern era are based on the peasantry. Although peasant revolt theorists usually recognize that successful revolutions are not led by peasants, and thus they do not leave a strong imprint on the character of the regimes that come to power through such struggles, they pay little attention to the role of groups other than peasants in revolution. Instead, this research follows Skocpol in concluding that too narrow a focus on the agrarian economy obscures understanding of the peasant-based revolutions. It is also in agreement with her emphasis on the importance of capitalist development in changing relations between states and classes, rather than commercialization and market penetration. Thus, both military backwardness and political dependency have affected the occurrence and course of social revolutions in a number of countries, including Ethiopia. And consistent with her analysis, the Ethiopian upheaval of 1974 led to further state centralization. However, Skocpol's focus is not helpful when attempting to understand the peasant-based revolution which took place in Tigray after the overthrow of the old regime. There was little in the structural conditions or international configuration that favored a successful outcome for revolution in Tigray, and even less to explain why the TPLF of a number of contending forces would dominate that revolution, as opposed to Skocpol, who emphasized international factors in explaining revolution. This study argues the importance of indigenous factors. While these theorists concentrate on structural crisis and do not seriously consider political factors, this study contends that the actions and policies of the Derg were crucial in developing opposition among both the petite bourgeoisie and the peasants of Tigray. Moreover, it also holds that Derg control of the urban centers forced the Tigrayan opposition into the countryside, where revolution could only be successful if it gained the support of the peasantry. Derg hegemony, which denied a rule for the civilian petite bourgeoisie and for the ethnic communities in the state, in turn gave a nationalist character to the Tigrayan revolt. Indeed, nationalist sentiments served to politically motivate and link in the struggle the petite bourgeoisie and peasants. The petite bourgeoisie's resentment at political marginalization, peasant concern over declining living standards, and their joint fear that Derg hegemony in the state represented a new and more powerful form of domination by a non-indigenous ethnic elite, gave rise to an even more forceful nationalism which became the central focus of the revolution. Peasant revolt theorists reject or de-emphasize the role of political parties in either stimulating or leading revolutions because they consider such approaches to be voluntarist. However, the contention here is that structures only frame the perimeters of revolutionary possibilities. They cannot govern process or determine consequences. As Hawes has noted, quote, Extant theory is inadequate for explaining what transforms endemic peasant grievances into a willingness to take the risky step of joining as opposed to quietly supporting a revolutionary movement. End quote. In this light, the role of the TPLF was critical to the success of the Tigrayan Revolution. However, this research does not endorse party-centric analyses which ignore the critical part played by the peasants in influencing the nature, course, and objectives of the revolution. At every stage of the revolution, peasants had a marked and at times determining influence. End of chapter 1.